Today, we are diving into one of the most exciting and fun creative aspects of role playing games dungeon design. Whether you're a seasoned game master or dungeon master or new to the role, crafting compelling dungeons and by extension adventures is both an art and a science. Today, we'll explore the essential elements of designing memorable dungeons and encounters, and I'll share some tips and strategies to help you create adventures that will captivate your players. GameMasters here, and let's start with the basics. At its core, a dungeon is a structured adventure location where players face challenges, solve puzzles, and interact with the environment. Dungeons can be a part of a much larger adventure. They can be a one-shot where the players simply roll up characters specific to that session, enter the dungeon, fight its monsters, and then take off with the loot. Or the dungeon can be a conduit from one part of an overarching adventure to another. But a great dungeon goes beyond just traps and monsters. It should offer a balanced mix of combat, exploration, and role-playing opportunities. When designing a dungeon, consider these questions. What is the dungeon's story? Why does it exist? Is it an ancient ruin, a hidden cultist lair, or a deadly labyrinth of elemental evil? Establishing a clear theme and purpose will help guide the design process and make the dungeon feel cohesive. You will also want to determine the level of challenge. Tailor the difficulty to your party's level. Consider their skills, abilities, and current equipment. A dungeon that's too easy, that's boring, while one that's too hard can be frustrating. Strive for a good balance, and don't be afraid to throw in a seemingly difficult encounter, but also consider placing an item into the beginning areas along with a dangerous monster somewhere in the middle. The monster won't be there for them to battle, though. They certainly can attempt to just go up against it with brute force, but the idea is for them to use the item to deal with that monster. For example, in a recent dungeon delve, I had a pack of mechanical dogs that an evil artificer had created. In the opening of the dungeon, the players found a scrap of paper that had this inscribed on it. Green means stop, red means go. These mechanical dogs, while to many of us may seem obvious that red and green buttons mean stop and go, to this evil artificer, it was the opposite. And while my players did initially attempt to fight the dogs, they finally did put two and two together and managed to shut them down without much harm to themselves. And that is what I consider to be a puzzle encounter. Speaking of which, encounters are the heart of any dungeon. They can be combat-focused, puzzle-based, involve complex role-playing scenarios, or they can be a mixture of combinations. To make them memorable, create a variety of combat encounters by mixing different types of enemies and using environment to your advantage. For example, a battle in a crumbling underground dragon's lair might involve precarious ledges, lava, and decrepit ruins. Or a fight in a cavern might include water that is frigid and cold and waist-deep with razor-sharp rocks jutting out from everywhere. These are all going to add extra layers of challenge. Also, consider incorporating unique tactics or abilities for your enemies. Don't be shy in giving monsters the same thing that players will have access to, such as in this book, weapons mastery abilities. Puzzles should be challenging but fair. Ensure that they have a logical solution and offer clues throughout the dungeon. They need to fit the surroundings so that they are seamless with and the environment and not out of place. Likewise, traps can be a great way to add tension and a sense of caution so that players aren't simply just running through tunnels and rooms with reckless abandon. And be sure they're not overly punitive. A trap should feel like a clever obstacle rather than an unavoidable punishment. Should you populate your dungeons with NPCs, creatures that the players don't exactly need to fight, give them opportunities to interact with those NPCs and make moral decisions. What would the players do if you included a nomadic merchant that uses part of the cavern as his warehouse to store his goods? Would they ransack the wares while the merchant is in town, or would they simply ambush the merchant and take everything? Or would they live and let live, recognizing that this one individual is simply trying to make a living? Would they barter with him? Or what might happen if the players negotiate with an enemy to avoid what would be obvious bloodshed? Might they become allies later in which that enemy turned friend could help out with a sticky situation? These scenarios can enrich the story and provide deeper engagement. Of course, that kind of assumes that your players won't get all murder hobo with every living creature. Placing some interesting encounters within your dungeon can certainly add some unique twists and turns, but too, you'll also want to include actual twists and turns. The physical layout of a dungeon can impact how players experience it. I'll give you an example of a bad location, at least in my opinion. In Vecna Eve of Ruin, a portion of the adventure takes place within a massive colossus, a machine of sorts named Landro. In one of the areas, we are given this as the only description. This 30-foot tall chamber is choked with debris and is difficult terrain. And that's all we get. There's no encounters here, no mention of what type of debris. In the context of the adventure, the debris could either be rock and bits of crushed mountain, or it could be parts of the Colossus itself. But why is the terrain considered difficult? I get that you are moving over debris, but I am asking, what's the point of adding difficult terrain in this specific location? You might think that perhaps it's because of an encounter, and while there is an encounter in the area just before this one, there's a good chance that you're going to complete that fight before getting to this area. So again, what exactly was the point of difficult terrain? Those are the types of things you need to ask yourself when doing an overall design. Is there a specific reason for this area? For sure, you want to create a map that includes a variety of areas, such as hallways, rooms, and hidden passages. But there needs to be a logical flow to the dungeon, as well as also space for exploration. Avoid overly linear designs. You don't want just a long hallway with doors jutting off to the left and right. As entertaining as it was to watch Scooby-Doo and his pals dart back and forth between the doors while being chased by the bad guy, translating that over into an adventure just doesn't have the same impact. Include areas that catch the player's attention. You don't have to include something in every area, but when you do include something, make sure it matters. If you're going to go out of your way to detail that in the center of a kitchen that there is a tea kettle, you can bet your favorite D20 that one of your players is going to take it, even if it has zero bearing on anything else in the dungeon. But as I just mentioned about area L16 inside the Landro Colossus, you do need to at least have a reason for the area being there. Looking at our kitchen scenario, if the party is exploring a wizard's tower, having a kitchen in there would be a little out of place, but converting it into an alchemy alcove, now that makes sense. You can also incorporate features that change as the players explore the dungeon. For example, there might be a section of the dungeon that floods gradually, or a corridor that shifts position. All of that can add extra layer of intrigue and challenge. But too, you'll also want to add elements that encourage players to interact with the things that they find and encounter. Let's go back to our tea kettle example. If it's something you want to include, perhaps make it because one of the players enjoys brewing tea. Perhaps it will be an item that is needed later in the dungeon to solve a puzzle. One of the most rewarding aspects of dungeon design is allowing the players to make meaningful choices, setting up the environment so that their choices have meaning. To accomplish this, you can design encounters and puzzles with multiple ways to solve them. This lets players ultimately use their creativity and problem-solving skills, and so as to not take away from player agency, don't be adverse to listening to their solutions to a puzzle. Perhaps they have come up with another alternative in solving that puzzle that you just really never considered. That said, don't be afraid to put in negative consequences, both immediate and long-term. Should the players decide to rush into a Blazebear's lair being noisy and boisterous, things are probably not going to go well. Some encounters should take a degree of planning and not just blindly rushing in. Also, be open to possibilities that you didn't plan for. Again, we are talking about player agency here. You'll need to know how to adjust elements on the fly. Let's say you have a thief that's holed up in a cavern. Perhaps he found that merchant's stash, and the merchant has hired you, the players, to root the thief out. But what happens if the party instead chooses to negotiate with the thief? And this is most certainly going to affect the outcome of the dungeon if you didn't plan for it, as well as the overall story. Should the player choose to negotiate with that thief when you planned for it to be a fight to the death, well, that is going to result in a different outcome than a direct confrontation with that thief. Going hand in hand with being able to adjust things on the fly, pay attention to how players interact with the dungeon, be flexible, and be ready to adapt the story based on their actions. This makes the experience dynamic and responsive, direct to the decisions that they have made, thus giving to player agency. Remember, you made the dungeon, you made its layout. You populated it with monsters, traps, and treasure, but it's the characters that are the key explorers. Let them explore what you crafted and let them weave the story. We spoke earlier about making each area have meaning. Likewise, you also want to ensure that each encounter, each fight, each monster within the dungeon makes sense, and it isn't extremely out of place. You can also take the same concept to a much larger arena. Believe it or not, you can take these basic concepts and apply them to things beyond just a dungeon building. I take the same approach to making a small town, a large sprawling city, even an entire region of the land, as well as the entire planet. Taking it a step further, I've even used the same concepts even in my Spelljammer sessions where the players are moving between worlds. If I had to summarize this into an overall concept, I would say that dungeon designing, town or city designing, world designing for that matter, is a very creative and rewarding process. Focus on engaging encounters, thoughtful layouts, player interaction with the environments, and you'll find that your adventures are memorable and something that your players are going to talk about long after the session ends. My goal in creating a dungeon or adventure is to give my players something to think about, something to talk about between sessions. I love it when they reach out to me to ask questions about the dungeon or whatever it is that they've just run through on a day when we're not actually playing. That confirms to me that I've done my role as a game master properly. My name is Brian, and I've been playing and running role-playing games since the 1980s, and I want to thank everyone for watching today's video. I also want to thank my YouTube and Patreon supporters, as their contributions have most certainly helped this channel to grow. If you'd like to check out becoming a YouTube or Patreon member, I've got a link posted down below me, this little talking box here, but also down in the description. I also have a fun Discord where we get to talking about various topics of role-playing games, to what we had for dinner last night. I had a homemade chicken pot pie, by the way. I also use Discord to help with ideas for future videos. So if you'd like to help shape the direction of the channel, jump into the Discord and let's chat. But to that end, I also like to engage with everyone down in the comments below, so feel free to leave a comment down there as well. If you are a seasoned DM, please leave some pointers down in the comments. What are your tips for dungeon building? And if you'd like to see a follow-up where I go into detail about city planning, let me know that down in the comments as well. And if there is enough interest, I'd be happy to detail out how to make a fun cityscape for your players to explore. Until next our paths cross, may that tea kettle that you pick up not turn out to be a mimic.